I'm Hailey, 32, a photographer from Boston who survived a decade of estrangement from my family. 10 years after being called trash and told to get out, I finally faced my mother again. Her cruel words cut as deep as they had when I was 18, but this time I was ready. With one carefully chosen sentence, I silenced the woman who had spent my entire childhood making me feel worthless. Before I share how I stood up to my mother after a decade, let me know where you're watching from in the comments and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to find your voice against someone who was supposed to love you. Growing up in an affluent Connecticut suburb, I always felt like I was living someone else's dream. Our sprawling colonial house with its manicured lawn and tennis court was the perfect showcase for my mother Amanda's success as a renowned surgeon. My father Thomas, a corporate lawyer, spent more time at his downtown office than he did at home, but when he was around, he mostly deferred to my mother's authority on all family matters. From my earliest memories, I knew I was different from what my parents wanted. While my younger sister Sophia excelled in science competitions and brought home perfect report cards, I was drawn to colors, shapes, and capturing the world through my eyes. My mother noticed this divergence early. "Hailey, put those crayons away and focus on your math workbook," she would say, her voice sharp with disapproval. "You think any college will care about your little drawings? Sophia already knows her multiplication tables, and she's 2 years younger than you." These comparisons were constant, a steady drumbeat that accompanied my childhood. At family gatherings, my mother would parade Sophia around like a prize, while introducing me as an afterthought. "This is our younger daughter Sophia, who just won the regional science fair, and this is Hailey." My father, though occasionally protective, mostly remained silent during these moments. Once when I was 9, I overheard him speaking to my mother after a particularly harsh criticism session aimed at my artistic interests. "Amanda, don't you think you're being a bit hard on her? She's just a child." "I'm preparing her for the real world, Thomas," my mother replied coldly. "Do you want her to end up as some struggling artist living in a shabby apartment? Is that the future you envision for our daughter?" That was the end of the conversation, and my father never brought it up again. At school, I wasn't allowed to pursue friendships with children my mother deemed unsuitable. This included Lily, whose single mother worked as a dental hygienist, and Marcus, whose family lived in the less prestigious part of town. My wardrobe was carefully curated to project the image my mother wanted: preppy, expensive, and conventional, despite my preference for more colorful, creative clothing. To cope with the constant pressure and criticism, I developed my own secret world. In the space between the back of my closet and the wall, I created a tiny art studio where I would spend hours drawing and painting with supplies smuggled from the school art room. I also had imaginary conversations with artists I'd read about, particularly Frida Kahlo, whose determination to express her truth despite pain resonated with me even then. While our family appeared perfect from the outside, successful parents, beautiful home, academically accomplished children, the reality was far different. Dinner conversations revolved around my mother's surgical triumphs and Sophia's latest achievements, while any mention of my day would be quickly redirected or dismissed. "Nobody wants to hear about your art project, Hailey," my mother would say with a dismissive wave. "Sophia was just telling us about her perfect score on the biology test." By the time I reached middle school, I had learned to make myself as invisible as possible at home, speaking only when spoken to and keeping my interests hidden. But the artistic flame inside me refused to die. And as I entered my teenage years, it would grow into a fire that my mother could no longer ignore or extinguish. What I didn't realize then was that my mother's treatment would only worsen as I developed my own identity. The subtle undermining of my childhood was merely the prelude to the more direct confrontations that awaited me as a teenager. But even in those early years, the seeds of resilience were being planted, seeds that would eventually help me stand up to her after a decade of silence. By 15, I had fully embraced photography as my passion, much to my mother's increasing dismay. My bedroom walls, once pristine and decorated according to my mother's taste, now displayed my black and white photographs of urban landscapes and portraits of strangers with interesting faces. "This looks like a bohemian mess," my mother declared during one of her room inspections. "Take these down immediately. What will people think when they visit?" I didn't take them down. It was one of my first acts of rebellion, and the punishment was swift: no phone privileges for a week. But it was worth it to preserve this small corner of self-expression. That same year, I met Ms. Jacobs, the new photography teacher at my high school. She recognized something in my work that others had missed. "You have a unique perspective, Hailey," she told me after class one day. "You don't just capture images, you capture feelings. That's something that can't be taught." Under her guidance, I began developing my technical skills and artistic voice. She introduced me to the works of Diane Arbus, Vivian Mayer, and Annie Leibovitz women, who had forged their own paths in photography despite obstacles. When I won first place in the school's annual art competition with a series of photographs documenting elderly people's hands alongside their most treasured possessions, my mother's reaction was ice cold. "Congratulations," she said, without looking up from her medical journal. "Did you finish your SAT prep? Your preliminary scores were disappointing." The fact that I'd beaten seniors as a sophomore meant nothing to her. That night I overheard her on the phone with my aunt. "It's just a phase," she said dismissively. "Sophia is the one with real talent. Did I tell you about her science project? The judges said it was college-level work." As my father's business trips became more frequent, lasting weeks instead of days, my mother's criticism intensified. There was no buffer between us, no one to occasionally step in and deflect her attention. My 16th birthday marked a particularly painful memory. My mother had organized a dinner party with her colleagues and their children, none of whom were my friends. The conversation revolved around college admissions and medical school prospects. "Hailey wants to study photography," my mother announced to the table with a tight smile. "We're trying to guide her toward more practical options, of course." Dr. Reynolds, one of her surgical partners, laughed. "My nephew went through that phase too. Now he's in law school where he belongs." The entire table chuckled while I sat there humiliated and invisible. Later that night, when I tried to express how hurtful the dinner had been, my mother's response cut deep. "You embarrassed me in front of my colleagues with your sulking. When will you grow up and start thinking about your future like Sophia does?" My academic performance began to suffer as I poured more energy into photography, which had become my lifeline. My grades, once solidly in the B range, slipped to C's in subjects like chemistry and calculus. Each report card became another battleground. During my junior year, I met Jordan, whose warm, chaotic family was everything mine wasn't. His parents welcomed me with genuine interest, asking questions about my photography and actually listening to the answers. The first time I stayed for dinner at their house, I nearly cried when Jordan's mother put one of my photographs on their refrigerator alongside family artwork. "You've got real talent," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Of course, my mother found ways to undermine this relationship too. "The Millers live in that small ranch house near the community college, don't they?" she remarked after meeting Jordan once. "I suppose Jordan will take over his father's plumbing business after high school." The fact that Jordan was actually a gifted writer, who had already been published in several literary magazines, didn't matter to her. He wasn't from the right social circle, so he wasn't good enough for her daughter. The breaking point came during my senior year. I had secretly applied to the Rhode Island School of Design, submitting a portfolio that Ms. Jacobs had helped me prepare. When the thick acceptance package arrived with a substantial scholarship offer, I felt vindicated. For once, I had proof that my passion could lead somewhere meaningful. I showed the letter to my mother, hoping against hope for approval, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, she took my portfolio, months of work carefully compiled and beautifully presented, and dropped it into the outdoor fire pit during one of her garden parties. "This nonsense ends now," she declared, as I watched the flames consume my photographs. "You will attend pre-med at Yale like we've always planned. This discussion is over." That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, something shifted inside me. The pain was still there, but alongside it grew a fierce determination. If my mother couldn't see my value, I would have to find people who could. With less than 3 months until graduation, I began making secret plans to leave behind the suffocating perfection of my family home and create a life where I could breathe. The night before my high school graduation remains etched in my memory, like an overexposed photograph, too bright, too sharp, almost painful to look at even years later. I had received my scholarship confirmation from Rhode Island School of Design that afternoon and decided it was time to make my stand. My acceptance to Yale's pre-med program had also arrived weeks earlier, championed by my mother with announcements to everyone in her social circle. Dinner that evening was unusually quiet. My father had returned from a business trip in London. Sophia was texting under the table, despite the no phones rule that was strictly enforced only for me and my mother, was discussing a complicated surgery she had performed that day. "I've made my decision about college," I said during a rare pause in conversation. The words came out steadier than I expected. My mother smiled clearly, misinterpreting my meaning. "Finally embracing your future at Yale, I told Thomas you would come around." "No," I replied, taking a deep breath. "I'm accepting the scholarship to Rhode Island School of Design. I'm going to study photography." The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked up from his plate with an expression of alarm. Sophia's fingers froze over her phone screen. My mother's face transformed from confusion to disbelief to cold fury in the span of seconds. "That is not happening," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "We did not raise you to throw away your potential on a hobby." "It's not a hobby to me," I insisted. "It's my passion and I'm good at it. The scholarship committee thought so too." "A scholarship to an art school," she scoffed. "What will that get you?" "A lifetime of struggle and mediocrity. Is that what you want?" "Amanda," my father attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we should discuss this calmly." "There's nothing to discuss." My mother cut him off. "Hailey is going to Yale as planned. End of story." "No," I said again, louder this time. "I'm 18 tomorrow. I can make my own decisions." My mother stood up so suddenly her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "As long as you live under this roof and we pay for your education, you will do as we say." "Then I won't live under this roof anymore," I replied, standing to face her. "And I don't need your money. I have the scholarship." What followed was an explosion unlike anything I had ever witnessed from my usually composed mother. She slammed her hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us, by throwing away the opportunities we've worked so hard to provide. You've never supported anything I care about." I countered, years of suppressed feelings rushing out. "You've never once come to any of my photography exhibits. You burned my portfolio because it was distracting you from what matters. It matters to me," I shouted back, tears streaming down my face now. "Why can't that be enough? Why can't you just be proud of me for being me?" My mother's face contorted with disgust as she delivered the words that would sever our relationship for the next decade. "You're trash, a disappointment, not my daughter. Get out if that's your choice, but don't expect anything from us ever again." My father sat frozen, his mouth open but no sound coming out. His silence in that moment was its own form of rejection. Sophia looked between us with wide eyes before lowering her gaze to her lap. Later that night, she would slip into my room as I packed. "I think your photography is amazing," she whispered, pressing a wad of cash into my hand. "I'm sorry I never said anything before." "Why didn't you ever stand up for me?" I asked, the hurt evident in my voice. She looked away. I was scared she would turn on me too. I understood then that Sophia was trapped in her own way, the golden child who could never step out of line without risking everything. It would be years before we would speak again. That night, I packed a single suitcase with my clothes, my camera equipment, and the few photographs I had hidden from my mother's purge. As the sun rose on my 18th birthday and graduation day, I walked out of my childhood home with no plan beyond getting to Rhode Island somehow. My mother's words echoed in my head with each step. "You're trash, a disappointment, not my daughter." What she didn't realize was that in trying to break me, she had instead set me free. The first few months of independence were brutal. After graduation, which my parents attended for appearances' sake, but didn't speak to me during, I moved into a tiny apartment near campus that I shared with two other art students. Ms. Jacobs had helped me secure a job as a photographer's assistant at a local studio that specialized in wedding photography, and I worked at a coffee shop on weekends to make ends meet. My scholarship covered tuition, but little else. There were nights I went to bed hungry days, I walked miles to save bus fare, and moments I questioned every decision I'd made. But there was also freedom, exhilarating, terrifying freedom to create without criticism, to explore my vision without someone telling me it was worthless. Ms. Jacobs became my lifeline during that transition. She let me stay in her guest room that first week after the confrontation with my mother, helped me navigate financial aid paperwork, and connected me with alumni who could offer guidance. "Your parents are wrong about you, Hailey," she told me one evening as we sorted through scholarship applications. "One day they'll realize what they've lost." I wanted to believe her, but the wound was too fresh, the rejection too complete. The few times I tried to call home, my mother refused to speak to me, and my father's brief, awkward conversations always ended with him saying, "Your mother is still very upset." Eventually, I stopped calling. Through distant relatives, I occasionally heard updates. My sister was thriving at Yale's pre-med program. My father had made partner at his law firm. My mother had received an award for surgical excellence. None of it included me. Meanwhile, I was building my own life brick by painful brick. My first year in art school was a revelation. I was surrounded by people who spoke my language, who understood the compulsion to create, who valued the very things my family had dismissed. "Your work has raw emotion," my photography professor commented during a critique session. "There's an honesty in your portraits that cuts straight to the heart." What he didn't say, but what I knew, was that this honesty was born from pain. Many of my early photographs explored themes of absence, isolation, and silent spaces, unconscious reflections of my family situation. During my sophomore year, I met Zoe in an advanced darkroom techniques class. Outspoken and fiercely loyal, she became the sister I had effectively lost. When I finally told her the full story of my family estrangement, her response was immediate and fierce. "They didn't deserve you," she declared, wrapping me in a tight hug. "We're your family now." And slowly, that became true. Holidays spent with Zoe's boisterous extended family, Thanksgiving at Ms. Jacobs' apartment, impromptu celebrations with fellow photography students. I was building a chosen family who loved me for exactly who I was. By my junior year, I had secured an internship with Marcus Wright, a photographer known for his unflinching documentary work in marginalized communities. He pushed me beyond technical mastery toward finding my unique voice. "Good photography makes people look," he told me. "Great photography makes people feel. You've got the potential for greatness, but you're holding something back." He was right. Despite my growing skills and opportunities, I was still protecting myself, still afraid to be fully vulnerable in my work. The wall I'd built against my family's rejection had also blocked part of my artistic expression. It was during this period that I finally began therapy, using the free counseling services at the university. Dr. Warner helped me understand that my mother's treatment wasn't about my failings, but about her own insecurities and rigid worldview. "You were never the problem, Hailey," she said during one particularly emotional session. "You were just the canvas onto which your mother projected her fears and expectations." This revelation didn't heal the wound immediately, but it gave me a new perspective. I wasn't trash, I wasn't a disappointment. I was simply a person who didn't fit the narrow definition of success my mother had created. With this growing self-awareness, my photography began to evolve. My senior thesis project, titled Unseen, featured portraits of people who felt invisible in their own families: the queer child of conservative parents, the artistic son of a military family, the daughter who chose business over her family's farming tradition. Each portrait was paired with a still life of objects that represented their true passions and identity. The exhibition received critical acclaim, with the local arts magazine calling it a powerful exploration of authenticity in the face of familial expectation. I graduated with honors and a growing portfolio of professional work. By 26, I had moved to New York City and secured a position as assistant to a renowned fashion photographer while developing my own documentary projects on the side. When my first solo gallery show opened in a small but respected Chelsea gallery, I sent invitations to my parents and sister, not expecting a response. None came. Yet the show, featuring a series called Family Frames, examining the performative nature of family portraits, was a turning point in my career. The New York Times called it a poignant deconstruction of family mythology, and several pieces sold to private collectors. As my professional reputation grew, so did my personal stability. Therapy had helped me process much of my childhood trauma, though the hurt never fully disappeared. I began teaching photography workshops to disadvantaged youth, finding purpose in helping others find their visual voice. And then there was Alex, a graphic designer I met while collaborating on a magazine spread. Thoughtful, creative, and raised in a warm, supportive family, he showed me what healthy love looked like. "Your family missed out on knowing an extraordinary person," he told me after I finally shared my full history with him. "That's their loss, not yours." And by my early 30s, I had built the life my mother said I'd never have: professional respect, financial stability, meaningful relationships. I had proven her wrong in every way that mattered, but the final test of my healing would come from an unexpected source: an email from my sister, after 10 years of silence. The email from Sophia arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, nestled between a client invoice and a photography magazine subscription renewal. The subject line, "Family News," nearly made me delete it unread, assuming it was some distant relative's mass update. But the preview text stopped me cold. "Dad had a heart attack. He's stable but asking for you." My hands shook as I opened the message. "Hailey, I know it's been a long time, and I have no right to ask anything of you. Dad had a major heart attack 3 days ago. He's stable now, but will need bypass surgery next week. Before they took him to the hospital, your name was the first word he said. He's been asking to see you. I understand if you can't or don't want to come, but I thought you should know. The address is Boston General Hospital Room 415, Sophia." I stared at those words until they blurred emotions colliding like storm fronts. My father, who had stood by silently, while my mother dismantled my self-worth piece by piece. My father, who had never once called to check if I was alive during my first desperate year on my own. My father, who now wanted to see me when faced with his own mortality. I called my therapist, Dr. Warner, who had continued to see me virtually after I moved to New York. "What do you feel you want to do?" she asked after I'd explained the situation. "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me wants to ignore it. Why should I drop everything for people who dropped me? But another part is still hoping for resolution," she finished gently. "That's natural, Hailey. Just remember that you can visit your father without surrendering the boundaries you've built. You can see him on your terms." That evening, I discussed it with Alex over dinner in our Brooklyn apartment. "I'll support whatever you decide," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "And I'll come with you if you want backup." "What would you do?" I asked, needing his perspective. His expression grew thoughtful. "I'd probably go, but not with any expectations of a grand reconciliation. People rarely change fundamentally, especially after decades of behaving a certain way. But I'd want to know I'd given them the chance, so I wouldn't have regrets later." That night I couldn't sleep. Old memories surfaced like debris after a flood. The rare moments when my father had shown kindness, teaching me to ride a bike, bringing home a professional camera when I turned 16. His conflicted expression the night I left home. He had been weak, not cruel. A bystander, not an instigator. By morning, I had made my decision. I would go to Boston, see my father, but maintain firm boundaries. This wasn't about forgiveness. It was about closure. I emailed Sophia back with my flight details, packed a small suitcase, and informed my clients I would be unavailable for several days due to a family emergency. The flight to Boston felt surreal, as if I were traveling not just across states, but across timelines back to a life I had decisively left behind. Physical symptoms of anxiety manifested: clenched jaw, racing, heart-churning stomach as the plane began its descent. Boston General Hospital was a maze of identical corridors, and the antiseptic smell that all hospitals share. Following the signs to the cardiac care unit, I felt like I was moving through a dream. Room 415. The door was partially open. I took a deep breath and knocked softly. "Come in," called a female voice I recognized as Sophia's. I stepped into the room and time seemed to compress. My father looked so much older than I remembered, his once robust frame diminished against the white hospital sheets, his face lined and gray. Sophia stood beside the bed, her resemblance to our mother stronger now that she was in her late 20s. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my father's eyes focused on me, and he reached out a hand weakly. "Hailey," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You came." Something cracked inside me, not my resolve, but the hard shell of indifference I'd tried to maintain. Whatever else he had been, this man was my father, and he was clearly afraid. I moved to the bedside and took his hand briefly. "I came." Tears welled in his eyes. "I'm sorry." He said the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "I should have been stronger. Should have stood up for you." Before I could respond, Sophia interjected, "We should let Dad rest. The doctor said short visits only." She gestured toward the door. "Can we talk in the hallway?" Outside, the conversation with Sophia was stilted and awkward at first, years of silence creating a chasm between us. But gradually details emerged. Dad's health had been declining for years. Mother was still practicing medicine, but had become even more rigid and controlling. Sophia herself had completed medical school but was increasingly chafing under our mother's constant oversight of her career. "She's never stopped talking about you, you know," Sophia said quietly. "Usually to criticize your choices or wonder where she went wrong. But sometimes I catch her looking at your photographs online. She looks at my work." This revelation stunned me. Sophia nodded. "She would never admit it, but yes, after your show at the Bowman Gallery got that write-up in the Times, I caught her with the article. She said she was just confirming what a mistake you'd made, but she had circled your name with a pen." I didn't know what to do with this information. It didn't erase the hurt, didn't change the rejection, but it complicated the narrative I'd constructed about my mother's complete dismissal of my existence. "Dad wants everyone to gather at the house after his procedure next week," Sophia continued. "Just family. He says he has things he needs to say to all of us together." She hesitated. "Will you come?" Every instinct warned against it. Return to that house. Face my mother again after all this time. It seemed like inviting fresh trauma. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said carefully. "Dad might not have much time left," Sophia pressed. "The doctors say his heart is very damaged. This might be your only chance for, I don't know, some kind of closure." Closure. The word echoed Dr. Warner's advice. Maybe this was an opportunity to finally close a chapter that had remained painfully unfinished for a decade. "I'll think about it," I conceded. I spent the next few days visiting my father in short intervals, carefully avoiding the times when my mother would be there. Our conversations were superficial at first, my photography career life in New York Alex, but gradually shifted toward more substantial territory. "I failed you," he admitted during one visit. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but really I was just avoiding conflict, taking the easy way out. "Yes, you were," I agreed, not softening the truth for his comfort. "Your mother, she's not an easy woman to stand against." "I managed it at 18, I pointed out. He nodded slowly. "You were always stronger than me, than any of us really." After my father's successful surgery, the invitation to gather at the family home became more insistent. I consulted with Dr. Warner again, who suggested setting clear mental boundaries before attending. "Decide in advance what you need from this encounter," she advised. "Not what they might need from you, forgiveness, absolution, reconciliation, but what you need for your own healing journey." What did I need? Certainly not my mother's approval after all this time. Perhaps acknowledgement of the harm done, or simply the chance to show them all that I had survived and thrived despite their abandonment. The night before the gathering, I stood in my hotel room looking out at the Boston skyline, mentally preparing for what would surely be one of the most difficult encounters of my life. I had come this far. I would see it through. The drive to my childhood home felt like traversing a foreign country, where I once had citizenship, but had since been expatriated. The sprawling colonial looked exactly as I remembered it. Immaculate landscaping, imposing facade, perfect in every visible way. Just like the family image my mother had worked so hard to maintain. I parked my rental car behind several others in the circular driveway and sat for a moment gathering my courage. The family photo gallery that lined the front hallway would no longer contain images of me, I realized. 10 years of family events, holidays, and milestones would have been documented without my presence. Taking a deep breath, I approached the front door. Before I could ring the bell, it swung open to reveal Sophia looking tense, but attempting a smile. "You came," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Dad will be so happy." The interior of the house was as pristine as ever, though the decor had been updated in the decades since I'd left. Modern artwork had replaced the traditional landscapes, and the color scheme had shifted from warm beiges to cool grays. My mother's taste had evolved, but her obsession with perfection clearly remained intact. Family members were gathered in the large living room, aunts, uncles, cousins I barely recognized. Conversations hushed as I entered the room, eyes widening in recognition and surprise. My father sat in his favorite armchair looking frail but alert, his face lighting up when he saw me. And then I saw her. My mother stood by the fireplace, her posture rigid and defensive. She had aged, of course, her dark hair now streaked with silver fine lines around her eyes and mouth, but her expression remained the same controlled, critical assessing. For a moment, our eyes met across the room, and I felt a jolt of the old familiar fear followed immediately by a surge of something stronger, certainty in who I had become. I greeted my father first, then made my way around the room, exchanging awkward but polite greetings with relatives who seemed unsure how to address the prodigal daughter. Some were genuinely warm, like Aunt Catherine, who squeezed my hand and whispered, "It's so good to see you, dear. You look wonderful." Others were clearly uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact or limiting conversation to the blandest of topics. I wondered what version of my departure they had been told. Throughout these exchanges, my mother remained by the fireplace, watching, but not approaching. I didn't seek her out either. The confrontation would come soon enough. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, just as it always had been for family gatherings. I found myself seated between Sophia and a cousin directly across from my mother, a placement that could not have been accidental. The meal progressed with strained conversation. My father attempted to bridge the decade-long gap with questions about my career, which I answered honestly but carefully, not revealing too much of myself to this audience. "Your photographs were in the Museum of Modern Art exhibit last year, weren't they?" he asked with evident pride. "Yes," I replied, surprised he knew this detail. "A series on urban isolation." "We saw the write-up in the Times," he continued. "They called your work hauntingly intimate, if I remember correctly." My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "You've been following Hailey's career?" she asked, speaking about me as if I weren't sitting across from her. "Of course I have," my father replied with uncharacteristic firmness. "She's my daughter." The use of present tense, not "she was my daughter," hung in the air between us. As the meal progressed, tension built like pressure in a sealed container. Family members attempted to navigate around the elephant in the room, discussing safe topics like Cousin Jennifer's new baby and Uncle Robert's retirement plans. But the underlying current of unresolved conflict was palpable. The breaking point came during dessert, when the conversation turned to my recent photography award. Aunt Catherine had brought it up innocently enough, asking about the ceremony in New York. "It must have been exciting to receive such recognition," she said warmly. Before I could respond, my mother interjected, her voice sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "Yes, Hailey always did prefer attention over achievement." The table fell silent. In that moment, I realized nothing had changed. 10 years had passed. I had built a successful career and life, and still my mother could not acknowledge any value in my choices. "Actually," I said calmly, "the award was for a series documenting survivors of domestic violence rebuilding their lives. It was about their achievement, not mine." My mother's eyes narrowed. "Always so dramatic with your subject choices, creating controversy for attention." "Amanda," my father warned weakly, but she continued, "you could have had a real career, made a real difference as a doctor. Instead, you take pictures of people's misfortunes and call it art." I felt the old familiar pain rise up, but this time it was accompanied by a clarity that had taken years of therapy and self-work to achieve. I no longer needed her approval. I no longer feared her judgment. "My work has raised over $200,000 for domestic violence shelters," I stated quietly. "I teach photography, too, at risk youth every summer. My last book helped change legislation on support for trafficking survivors." What exactly about that isn't real enough for you? My mother's face flushed with anger. The controlled facade slipped, revealing the truth that had always lurked beneath her own insecurity and fear of anything that didn't fit her narrow definition of success. You abandoned this family, she hissed, jabbing a finger in my direction. You threw away everything we gave you, everything we built for you. I didn't abandon anyone, I countered, my voice steady. I was thrown away. By you. The dining room had become utterly silent, family members frozen in place, witnessing the confrontation that had been brewing for a decade. And then my mother delivered the words that echoed across time, the same rejection she had hurled at me the night before my graduation. Trash, get out of my life. You were never worthy of this family. The cruel statement hung in the air, shocking in its nakedness. Even relatives who had sided with my mother over the years looked uncomfortable now witnessing her unvarnished contempt. In the past, those words had devastated me, confirming my deepest fears about my worth and place in the world. But now, after years of building myself back up, of creating work that mattered, of forming relationships based on mutual respect, rather than conditional approval, they struck differently. I looked at my mother, really looked at her, and saw not the intimidating figure of my childhood, but a bitter woman unable to see beyond her own rigid boundaries, unable to love what she could not control. The moment of clarity brought with it a profound sense of peace. I didn't need to fight anymore. I didn't need to prove anything. With absolute calmness, I spoke the sentence that had been forming in my heart through years of healing. I forgive you for being unable to love the daughter who needed you most. The effect was immediate and stunning. My mother's expression froze, her mouth slightly open, words failing her, perhaps for the first time in her life. Around the table, relatives exchanged glances of shock, and from some quiet approval. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. In offering forgiveness, rather than seeking approval, I had reclaimed the narrative. My mother had expected anger, defensiveness, or submission, the reactions she could control and dismiss. Compassion was the one response she had no strategy for. I stood up slowly, my napkin placed deliberately beside my barely touched dessert. I came today for Dad, and I'm glad I did, but I won't subject myself to this anymore. Aunt Catherine rose as well. I'll walk you out, Hailey. As we moved toward the door, the spell of silence broke. Voices rose in confused conversation behind us. I heard my father calling my name weakly, but I kept walking. I had said what I needed to say. Outside on the porch, Aunt Catherine took my hands in hers. I should have said something years ago, she admitted, her eyes moist. We all should have. The way Amanda treated you was wrong. Why didn't you? I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Fear, mostly. Your mother has a way of making people afraid to cross her, but watching you stand up to her just now, she shook her head in admiration. You're the strongest one in this family, Hailey. You always were. As I drove away from my childhood home, I felt neither triumph nor despair, but a profound sense of completion. The circle that had begun with rejection had ended with forgiveness, not for my mother's benefit, but for my own. In that moment of perfect clarity, I had finally released the last grip of her power over me. The aftermath of the confrontation unfolded in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The very next morning, I received a text from Sophia. Can we meet for coffee, just us? At a small cafe near my hotel, my sister appeared looking both exhausted and somehow lighter. Everything exploded after you left, she explained, stirring her latte absently. Dad told Mom he was ashamed of how she treated you both yesterday and all those years ago. I've never heard him stand up to her like that. Really? I couldn't quite picture my conflict-avoidant father taking such a stand. Sophia nodded. He said facing death made him realize his greatest regret was not protecting you. And then she leaned forward, still seeming amazed by what she was about to share. Aunt Catherine and Uncle James both told Mom they'd always thought she was wrong about you, that they'd been following your career for years and were proud of what you'd accomplished. The revelation that family members had been silently supporting me all along brought mixed emotions, gratitude for their belated acknowledgement, but also pain that they had never reached out during my most difficult years. "I owe you an apology too," Sophia continued, her eyes downcast. "I should have been braver, should have stayed in touch even if Mom forbade it." "You were a child too," I reminded her. "We were both caught in her web, just in different ways." Over the next few days, I had several conversations with my father in his recovery room, away from my mother's presence. He spoke with a new honesty about his own failures and regrets. "I always admired your courage," he admitted. "The way you refused to compromise who you were even when it cost you everything. I wish I'd had half your strength." While these conversations didn't erase the past, they offered a new understanding of it. My father had been weak, yes, but he had also been trapped in his own way, afraid of losing the life he had built, afraid of standing alone against my mother's formidable will. 3 days after the confrontation, I received an unexpected letter delivered to my hotel. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably my mother's precise, controlled with perfectly formed letters. Inside was a single page. "Hailey." It began without greeting. "Your statement at dinner was presumptuous and inaccurate. I have always acted in what I believed was your best interest, trying to guide you towards security and success. That you chose to interpret this as a lack of love is your misunderstanding, not my failure. However, I acknowledge that my approach may have been overly rigid at times. Your recent professional accomplishments suggest that you have found a path that works for you, even if it is not the one I would have chosen. I do not expect or require your forgiveness, as I do not believe I acted wrongly in essence, only perhaps in degree. But for your father's sake, I am willing to establish a civil relationship moving forward. Amanda Harrison, MD." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even really an acknowledgement of harm done. But from my mother, it was as close to concession as I would ever get, an admission, however backhanded, that my path had led to legitimate success by even her exacting standards. I folded the letter and put it away, neither answering it nor discarding it. I realized exactly what I should have expected, my mother remaining essentially unchanged, while attempting to reestablish control of the narrative. Before returning to New York, I had one final conversation with Sophia about boundaries and expectations moving forward. "I'd like us to have a relationship," I told her honestly. "But I won't be coming to family holidays where Mom can take shots at me. I won't pretend everything is fine for appearance's sake." Sophia nodded in understanding. "I respect that. Maybe we can start with just the two of us getting to know each other again as adults. Phone calls, visits when I'm in New York." It was a beginning, tentative, fragile, but real. A year later, my father and Sophia attended the opening of my major gallery exhibition in Manhattan, a series titled Reconciliation, that explored how people navigate damage within family relationships. My mother did not come, but she sent a formal note acknowledging the invitation. In the crowded gallery, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and the chosen family I had built over the years, I watched my father study a particularly powerful image: an elderly woman and her adult daughter sitting at opposite ends of a table, a visible thread of red yarn connecting their hands despite the distance between them. "This is extraordinary work, Hailey," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've made visible what most people can't even put into words." Later that evening, at the small dinner celebration Alex had organized, my father raised his glass in a toast to Hailey, who taught us all that true strength isn't about power or control, but about having the courage to be authentically yourself. As the glasses clinked around the table, I felt the final piece of a long journey fall into place. The wound my mother had inflicted with those cutting words, "trash, get out of my life," had finally lost its power to hurt me. I had transformed it, like turning compost into fertile soil, into the foundation for a life rich with meaning, purpose, and genuine connection. In the years that followed, my relationship with my father deepened as he made consistent efforts to be present in my life. Sophia and I developed a new adult sisterhood based on mutual respect rather than shared childhood trauma. My mother remained at a carefully maintained distance, civil during our rare interactions, but never warm, never fully accepting. And that was okay. I had learned that family isn't always who raised you. Sometimes it's who you choose to surround yourself with who sees and celebrates your true self, rather than trying to mold you into someone else's vision. The greatest victory wasn't silencing my mother with that one sentence of forgiveness. It was finding my voice in the first place, learning to speak my truth, without needing her to validate it, learning to see my worth, without requiring her approval. I'd learned all of these lessons the hard way, but they'd made me into someone I could be proud of, someone who wouldn't compromise her integrity for the comfort of others, someone who understood that real family is built on honesty, loyalty, and mutual respect, rather than shared DNA and comfortable lies. Have you ever had to stand up to someone who was supposed to love you unconditionally? How did you find the strength to speak your truth when faced with rejection? Share your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more authentic stories about finding your voice and creating boundaries with family members who don't see your worth. Share this video with someone who might be struggling with similar family dynamics and needs to hear that they're not alone. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone who has hurt you isn't an angry retort, but a compassionate truth that sets you both free.